The blacksmith shop sat at the edge of Dunmore like something the town had tried to forget. Cedar trees pressed close on three sides. The roof had buckled in one corner. The padlock was the color of old blood. Nobody had worked the forge in 11 years, and the weeds through the gravel said so plainly. When Ruth Calloway inherited it, her cousins didn't bother hiding what they thought. Her Uncle Gerald said she could sell the lot for the taxes if she moved fast. Her cousin Diane called it a liability. The attorney read the terms without inflection, the way attorneys do, and Ruth drove home to a rented room in Lewisburg, with nothing in her hands but a hand-drawn map and a single sentence written on the back of it in a dead man's careful script. What most people understood about Elias Calloway was that he had lived small and quietly, and that he had not left much behind. He charged less than he should have. He turned no one away. He worked alone, and he kept his own counsel. And for 40 years, the people of that county brought him their broken things, and he fixed them without ceremony. A man like that, they figured, doesn't leave much behind. They were not entirely wrong. They were not entirely right either. There is a particular kind of patience that looks, from the outside, exactly like poverty. Elias had understood that. He had banked on it, in the most literal sense of the word. He had hidden what he meant to give away in the one place no one thought to look, inside the throat of the forge itself, behind 40 years of ash and heat and silence, waiting for the one person he believed would know what to do with it. Ruth was 38 years old, recently widowed, and short on almost everything. She had not come to Dunmore expecting anything. She had come because the map told her to, and because she had nowhere else in particular to be, and because the one thing Elias had ever said to her directly when she was 9 years old was that honest work done quietly is its own kind of inheritance. She hadn't understood it then. She drove up County Road 7 on a Tuesday in early April, and by nightfall she would understand it completely. The letter from the attorney's office arrived on a Wednesday, 9 days after Elias Calloway was buried in the Dunmore Methodist Cemetery in a plain pine box he had arranged and paid for himself 3 years prior. Ruth Calloway received it at the mailbox of the duplex she rented on Sycamore Street in Lewisburg, 41 miles south. She read it standing in the gravel drive in her work coat, the envelope still in her left hand. The letter said that her presence was requested at the offices of Alderman and Pruitt on the 14th of April at 10 o'clock in the morning for the reading of the estate of Elias Monroe Calloway, deceased. It said she was named as a beneficiary. It did not say of what. She had not seen Elias in 6 years. The last time was Thanksgiving at her Aunt Carol's house in Beckley, where Elias had sat at the far end of the table and eaten quietly and helped with the dishes afterward without being asked. He was 74 then. He had big hands, the kind that come from decades at an anvil, and he moved them carefully around the good china. Ruth had sat next to him for a while after the meal, and he had asked her 2 or 3 questions about her life and listened to the answers. That was the whole of it. He drove himself home that evening in a 1991 Ford pickup with 212,000 miles on it, and she never saw him again. Her husband Daniel had died in February, 11 weeks before the letter came. A blood clot. He was 41. They had been married 9 years and had no children, and the life insurance policy paid out $38,000, which after the funeral and the credit card debt left Ruth with just under $14,000 in a savings account and a monthly rent she could cover for roughly 8 more months before the math turned hard. She was working 30 hours a week at a dental office on Jefferson Street, filing and scheduling and occasionally sterilizing instruments. It was not enough. She knew it was not enough. She had not yet figured out what to do about that. The attorney's office was on the 2nd floor of a brick building in downtown Dunmore, above a hardware store that had been there since 1947. The waiting room had 4 chairs and a table with a fan of outdated magazines and a window that looked down on the main street. Ruth arrived at 9:52. Her cousin Gerald Mott was already there, in a canvas jacket, scrolling through his phone. His wife Diane sat beside him with a paper cup of coffee. Gerald looked up when Ruth came in and nodded. Diane said it was good to see her. Ruth said the same. They sat and waited. Two of Elias's other nephews arrived together at 10:05, Carl and Dennis Prater, who farmed a few hundred acres outside of Marlinton and had not been close to Elias but were close enough to be in a will. The attorney, a short man named Philip Pruitt, with a careful part in his gray hair, came out at 10:12 and apologized for the delay and led them all into a conference room with a long table and a window overlooking the alley behind the hardware store. He set a folder in front of him and opened it and began. Elias had left the house and its contents to Gerald, who was his brother's oldest son and had looked in on Elias the most consistently over the last few years. He had left the 1991 pickup to Carl Prater, who had once driven Elias to the hospital in Elkins when his appendix failed him and had waited 4 hours in the corridor to drive him home. He had left a savings account with $9,400 to be divided equally among 4 named grandchildren of a deceased sister. He had left his tools, with the exception of those in the shop, to Dennis Prater, who had shown some interest in woodworking. Philip Pruitt turned a page. To Ruth Ann Calloway, née Mott, he had left the blacksmith shop and its contents, located at 417 County Road 7, Dunmore, West Virginia, on a parcel of 1.2 acres described in the attached deed. That was all. Philip Pruitt set the folder down and asked if there were questions. Gerald said he thought the shop was on the same parcel as the house. Pruitt said it was not. Gerald sat back. Diane looked at the table. Carl Prater asked about the value of the pickup, and Pruitt said he didn't have an appraisal. Ruth sat with her hands flat on the table and said nothing. Afterward, in the parking lot, Gerald found her at her car. He wasn't unkind about it. He said the property taxes on the shop parcel ran about $640 a year, and that the structure probably didn't meet current code, and that there might be environmental liability with the coal and the old quench tanks. He said a man named Burkett had approached him once about the whole parcel, but that was before Elias died, and before the property had been divided. He thought Burkett might still be interested in the shop lot separately. He said he could make a call if Ruth wanted. Ruth said she'd think about it. Gerald nodded and got in his truck, and that was that. She sat in her car for a few minutes before starting it. The main street of Dunmore was quiet. A woman walked past with a stroller. A dog lay in the sun in front of the hardware store. Ruth thought about Elias at the end of that Thanksgiving table, moving his big hands carefully around the dishes. She thought about the fact that he had known her name well enough to write it in a will. She thought about the fact that out of everything he had owned in 79 years, he had chosen to leave her a building she had never seen. 3 weeks later, a manila envelope arrived in her mailbox with no return address. Inside was a hand-drawn map on graph paper, precise and to scale, with County Road 7 marked in blue ink and the shop lot outlined in a careful rectangle. The roads were labeled. The cedar trees on the north side were indicated with small repeating marks. The padlock on the front door had an arrow pointing to it, and next to the arrow, in Elias's handwriting, a number. The combination. On the back of the map, in the same hand, a single sentence. It said, "There is more here than it looks like, Ruth. Start with the floor." Ruth left Lewisburg on a Tuesday morning in early April, before 7, while the fog was still sitting in the lower fields, and the light had not yet decided what it wanted to be. She had the map on the passenger seat, folded to the relevant section, weighted down with a half-empty water bottle. She had a thermos of coffee, a pry bar she had borrowed from her neighbor Dale, a flashlight, and a pair of leather work gloves with the left thumb worn through. She had not told anyone where she was going. There was no one in particular to tell. Route 60 through Lewisburg was familiar enough. 2 lanes of state road running northwest past the fairgrounds and the grain cooperative, and a stretch of horse farms behind white 4-board fencing that went on for nearly 3 miles. She had driven this road a dozen times in the last few years, visiting Daniel's sister in Frankfurt, and the familiarity of it was almost painful in the way familiar things become painful after a loss. Not because they have changed, but because they have not. She held the thermos against the wheel with her wrist and drank and watched the fencing go by. Past Frankfurt, the road began to lift into the hills, and the farms thinned out and were replaced by second-growth timber, tulip poplar and red oak still bare at the upper branches, though the understory was starting to green. She passed a sawmill that was running, the whine of it audible through the closed windows. A stack of fresh-cut lumber, yellow as butter in the morning light. She passed a Baptist church with a marquee sign out front, missing several letters so that the remaining ones spelled nothing in particular. The road dipped through a hollow and crossed a creek on a concrete bridge with no railing to speak of, and came back up the other side into open farmland again. At the junction with County Road 7, she turned left onto gravel. The sound changed immediately, the steady hum of blacktop replaced by the irregular percussion of loose stone under the tires, and Ruth slowed to 30. The road was single-lane with occasional pull-offs worn into the shoulder where two vehicles might pass each other if both drivers were cooperative. On her right, a pasture ran to a tree line. On her left, a bank of cut stone rose 8 or 10 feet, moss thick on the north face, water seeping through in a thin, continuous sheet that had stained the rock orange below the waterline. She had not been on a road like this in years. She had grown up on one, outside of Raynell, and the sound of the gravel under the car brought something back that she did not try to name. After 2 miles, the gravel gave way to packed dirt, and the road narrowed further so that the tree branches on both sides nearly met overhead. This section was not on any map she had seen other than Elias's hand-drawn one, and she trusted it now because she had no alternative. The dirt was soft from recent rain and her tires left clean tread marks in it. She could see no other marks ahead of her, no tire tracks going in or coming out, which meant no one had been down this road in at least several days. The trees pressed in. The world closed to a single corridor of budding branches and gray sky, and the road ahead. The grain elevator appeared first, just visible through a gap in the trees to the north. A corrugated steel cylinder maybe 60 feet tall with a conveyor arm angled off one side. It was not running. She couldn't tell if it was seasonal or permanent. Past it, on the right side of the road, a diner sat behind a gravel parking lot completely empty of cars. A hand-lettered closed sign in the window, and a faded menu board above the door still advertising the breakfast special at a price that had not been current in many years. The awning over the door was the green and white stripe of a particular era of small-town commerce, faded to gray and green now, one corner pulling free of its bracket and hanging at a tired angle. She passed a water tower set back from the road on 4 rusted legs, the tank itself painted white once, and now the color of old bone. The name of the township stenciled on the side in letters she could not fully make out because 2 of them had been obscured by rust. Something. Then O. Then R. Then something. The ladder up the side was missing 3 rungs near the bottom. She noted all of this the way she had learned to note things, cataloging the pieces of a place without drawing conclusions. The way Daniel used to say she did, that she could walk into a room and inventory it completely without letting on that she'd done so. She thought about that for a moment and then put it away. The map indicated a left turn at a rusted gate, and she found the gate exactly where Elias had drawn it. A livestock gate wired shut with a length of galvanized fencing wire looped over the post. She got out of the car and unwound the wire and pushed the gate open and drove through, and got out again, and wired it shut behind her, because that was what you did. The 2-track beyond the gate was barely that, the center berm high with dead grass flattened by winter, the ruts on either side shallow but consistent, which meant Elias had driven in and out of here regularly enough to keep them defined even without recent use. She kept the car in the ruts and went slowly. The shop appeared through a stand of eastern red cedar, 4 or 5 trees tight together with their low branches interleaved, so that the building behind them was only visible in pieces at first. A corner of rusted tin roofing, the vertical boards of the siding, dark with weathering. Then she cleared the cedars and had the whole picture at once. It was smaller than she had imagined, maybe 24 feet by 30. A simple rectangle with a single door on the near end and 2 small windows on the long south wall, both intact. The gutter along the north eave had pulled free at one end and hung at an angle, and a section of the roofing had buckled over what she guessed was a rafter that had given way. Weeds grew up through the gravel apron around the building, dock and mullein, and one ambitious ailanthus already waist-high near the northeast corner. She sat with the engine off and looked at it. A padlock the color of dried blood hung on the hasp of the door. The weeds said no one had walked through them recently. The windows were intact, and the door was plumb in its frame. And the chimney, a double-wide brick stack rising from the center of the roof, was straight and clean and showed no sign of settling or lean. Every other surface on the building communicated abandonment. The chimney communicated something else. She wasn't sure what to call it. Care, maybe. Intention. She pulled on her work gloves, picked up the pry bar, and got out of the car. She had not planned to stop at the feed store. She had driven past it twice on County Road 7 without registering it as anything other than a low cinder block building with a tin roof and a hand-painted sign above the door that said, "Vess Feed and Supply," in letters that had been retouched so many times the paint was thick as putty at the edges. But on her second pass, pulling back out from the gate after her first look at the shop, she saw a man in the side yard, stacking 50-pound bags of mineral supplement onto a wooden pallet. And something about the way he moved, unhurried and systematic, made her slow the car. She pulled into the gravel lot and got out. His name was Harlan Vess, and he was 71 years old, and he had been running the feed store since his father handed it to him in 1983, which meant he had been running it for longer than Ruth had been alive. He was a tall man, still carrying most of his height, despite the slight forward lean that comes to men who have spent decades bending over to lift things. His hands were the color and texture of saddle leather. He set down the bag he was holding and looked at her without expression and waited for her to say something, which Ruth recognized as the local habit of letting the stranger speak first. She told him who she was and who Elias had been to her. Harlan Vess nodded slowly, the way people nod when they are confirming something they already knew rather than learning something new. He said he had heard Elias passed in February. He said it matter-of-factly, without the softening inflection that people in cities use around death, and Ruth found she preferred it that way. He asked if she had been down to the shop yet. She said she had just come from looking at the outside of it. He nodded again and said she ought to come in for a minute and have some coffee, and he turned and walked toward the store entrance without waiting to see if she would follow. She followed. The inside of Vess Feed and Supply smelled of molasses and mineral dust and the particular dry sweetness of cracked corn. The front quarter of the space was given over to a counter and a few shelves of smaller goods, salt blocks and wormer and leather punch sets and coils of baling wire. Behind the counter, a coffee maker sat on a plywood shelf, a 32-cup commercial urn of the type Ruth associated with church fellowship halls, its red indicator light steady. Harlan Vess took a ceramic mug from a hook on the wall and filled it and set it on the counter in front of her. He did not ask how she took it. He filled his own mug and leaned against the back counter and looked at her. She asked him how well he had known Elias. He considered this in the way that careful people consider questions that have more than one true answer. He said he had known Elias 43 years, which was not the same thing as knowing him well, but that it was the kind of knowing that comes from proximity and consistency, and from being the sort of neighbors who help each other without making an occasion of it. He said Elias had kept his fuel tank full from Harlan's pump, and Harlan had brought his tractor drawbar to Elias 3 times over the years to be welded, and that the exchange of money in both directions had always been slightly less than the going rate. which was a form of mutual respect neither of them had ever named out loud. Ruth asked what kind of work Elias did. Harlan set his mug down and looked at the ceiling for a moment, not searching for words so much as choosing among them. He said Elias did what blacksmiths do: ironwork and tool repair, and the kind of fabrication that falls between what a machinist will take on and what a welder considers beneath him. He said Elias sharpened plow points and reset wagon tires, and made custom hinges, and fixed the cracked frame on the county road grader twice when the county didn't want to pay a shop in Elkins to do it. He said Elias charged less than he should have for most of his career, and that people knew it and brought him things accordingly. She asked if Elias had family who looked in on him toward the end. Harlan said her cousin Gerald came by maybe once a month the last couple of years, which was more than most. He said Elias did not require a great deal of looking in on, that he had a quality of self-sufficiency that went beyond stubbornness into something more considered, as though he had arranged his life deliberately so as not to need much from anyone. Harlan said this without judgment, as a plain description of a man he had watched operate for 4 decades. He picked up his mug again. Ruth asked, as carefully as she could, whether Elias had ever said anything about the shop, about what was in it or what he planned for it. Harlan was quiet for a moment. He looked at the counter between them, then back up at her. He said Elias was not a man who said much about his plans in advance. He said he had mentioned Ruth once, maybe 2 years before he died, in the context of a conversation about what happens to skilled work when the person who does it is gone. He had said there was one person in the family who understood the value of a thing that doesn't announce itself. Harlan did not elaborate on this, and Ruth did not push him. She reached into her jacket pocket and found a $1 bill and set it on the counter for the coffee. Harlan looked at it without touching it. He said the coffee wasn't for sale, and pushed the bill back across the counter with 2 fingers. Ruth put it away. She thanked him and picked up the last of her coffee and finished it standing there, and Harlan refilled his own cup, and they were quiet together for a moment, in the way that people can be quiet together when they have both known loss and don't feel the need to fill the space around it. At the door she stopped and asked him one more thing. She asked if he knew whether anyone had been maintaining the shop after Elias stopped working, keeping it clean, seeing to the inside of it. Harlan looked at her steadily. He said he couldn't say for certain. He said that Elias had driven past the store heading toward the shop lot as recently as October of last year, which was 4 months before he died, and that the truck had been heading in and not coming back out when Harlan last saw it that day, which meant he had stayed a while. He said he reckoned Ruth would find things more or less in order inside. He said he reckoned she would find a few things worth finding, and he said it in a tone that was not mysterious, only even the way a man speaks when he already knows the answer to a question, but understands it isn't his to give. Ruth nodded and went out into the April morning and drove back up the road to the gate. The combination on the padlock was 4 digits, and Elias had written them in the same careful hand as the rest of the map. Each number formed with the deliberateness of a man who had learned penmanship before it stopped being taught. Ruth worked the shackle through the sequence twice before it released, the mechanism stiff with disuse and cold, and when it finally gave, she felt the click in her palm before she heard it. She pulled the hasp free and set the padlock on the ground beside the door and took hold of the handle, which was a piece of 3/4-inch square bar stock bent into a loop and welded to a plate, simple and permanent, the kind of hardware a man makes for himself because he can. The door swung inward on hinges that did not complain. The smell came first. Coal dust and old iron and the particular mineral dryness of a space that has been heated many thousands of times and has absorbed that heat into its walls over decades until the walls themselves smell warm, even when the fire is long out. There was something else under it, neat's foot oil maybe, or the linseed that goes into some handle finishes, a smell that was organic and old and not unpleasant. Ruth stood in the doorway and let her eyes adjust. The 2 south-facing windows let in enough of the April morning to see by, and she did not reach for the flashlight yet. The shop was a single room. The forge sat at the center of the north wall, a traditional side-blast coal forge with a cast-iron firepot and a hand-crank champion blower mounted to the right of the tuyere, the crank handle worn smooth where Elias's hand had met it 10,000 times or more. The coal pot still held clinker, the fused residue of the last fire he had built in it, gray and glassy and light as pumice. Above the forge, the hood was a hand-riveted sheet steel funnel that rose to the flue collar set into the brick chimney, and the metal of it was dark with decades of smoke, the surface almost iridescent where the heat had cycled through it enough times to temper the steel itself. The chimney rose clean and straight through the roof, the flashing tight, no daylight visible around the collar. Against the east wall stood the anvil on its stump. It was a Fisher eagle, 200 pounds by the look of it, the waist of it carrying the cast relief of the eagle trademark that Fisher put on their anvils from the 1880s through the 1950s. The face was flat and unmarked by any serious abuse, which meant Elias had never struck it with a hammer directly, had always kept work between the steel and the iron, a discipline that takes years to make automatic. The Pritchell hole and the Hardy hole were clean. Someone had oiled the face recently enough that it still held a thin film. Ruth ran a gloved finger across it and the finger came away dark. The Hardy hole held a set tool she didn't recognize at first, a curved swage of some kind, hand-forged, the shank square and fitted to the hole with no slop at all. On the wall above the anvil, tools hung on cut nails in a row that ran the full length of the east wall. Flatters and fullers and a pair of spring swags on a U-bar, handled punches in 3 sizes, a hot cut and a cold cut, tongs of 4 varieties hung by their reins, a rounding hammer and a cross peen and a straight peen with the handle replaced in white ash, new enough that the wood had not yet darkened. At the far end of the row, a 3/8-inch socket wrench with the rubber grip worn smooth hung on its own nail. Beside it, a 1/2-inch drive torque wrench in a canvas sleeve. The tools were in order. They were clean. The west wall held a workbench of 2-inch maple planking on a steel base, the top surface worn smooth and dark with oil over what Ruth estimated was at minimum 30 years of use. A leg vise was bolted to the near end of the bench, a 112-pound Colombian with the screw exposed and greased. The post of it went through the bench and through the floor and was anchored to a buried timber below, the way a leg vise has to be anchored to be useful, which meant Elias had poured concrete or sunk a beam when he built the bench, which meant he had been thinking about permanence from the beginning. On the bench surface, a ball-peen hammer, a set of needle files in a leather roll, a wire brush, and a small can of Bostic Never Sees compound, with the lid set carefully back on top but not crimped down, the way you leave a can when you plan to come back to it. Ruth walked the room slowly. She opened the 2 windows on the south wall, the wooden frames swelling slightly with moisture and requiring the flat of her hand against the rail, and the light improved and the air moved. She checked the floor. It was dirt, packed hard over decades of foot traffic and swept clean, but not uniformly clean. Near the center of the room, roughly between the forge and the anvil, there was a section of oak planking laid into the dirt floor, 3 boards wide and perhaps 4 feet long, sitting slightly above the surrounding grade the way boards sit when there is something beneath them holding them up. The wood was old, but not rotten. The edges of the boards were clean cut, not rough, which meant they had been fitted deliberately and had been lifted and reset enough times that the edges had not had the chance to weather and blur. She pried the first board up with the bar she had borrowed from Dale. It came without much resistance, the wood solid but not anchored, simply sitting in a rebate cut into the surrounding hardpack. The second board was the same. The third required more effort. The end of it caught under a lip of packed earth that had built up over time, and she worked the bar carefully along the edge and levered it up and set it aside. Beneath the boards was a clay-lined pit approximately 2 feet deep and 2 feet across. The sides smoothed and fired hard in the way that clay fires when it is close to a forge for long enough. At the bottom of the pit sat a steel box, maybe 14 inches by 10 by 6, fabricated from quarter-inch plate with a lid that had been sealed around its full perimeter with a bead of weld. The weld was even and continuous and showed the hand of someone who had been welding for a long time. There was no lock. The lid was not meant to be opened from the outside by someone who did not know it was welded. It was meant to look, to anyone who found it without expecting it, like a solid box with a lid that had simply rusted shut. Ruth sat back on her heels and looked at it for a moment. The shop was quiet around her. The hand crank blower on the forge cast a long shadow across the floor in the morning light coming through the south windows. She could hear a crow somewhere in the cedars outside, 2 calls, and then silence. She reached down and lifted the box out of the pit. It was heavier than its size suggested, which told her something. She set it on the maple workbench and went back to her car for the angle grinder. The angle grinder was a 4.5-inch Makita that Ruth had bought with Daniel 3 years before he died, for a project in the basement of the house they had rented in Lewisburg that they never finished. It lived in a canvas bag with 2 spare discs and a face shield that still had the plastic film on the lens. She had brought it without entirely knowing why. Some instinct from reading Elias's note that suggested she might need to cut something. She fitted a cutting disc, plugged the grinder into the single outlet on the shop's south wall, a GFCI unit that was newer than anything else in the building and had been installed with care. The box flush and the plate straight. The outlet held current. She put on the face shield and set the grinder to the weld seam and began. The weld was good. It took her 11 minutes to cut the full perimeter, working slowly and stopping twice to let the disc cool, the grinder chattering against the dense bead and throwing a thin orange spray of sparks across the maple workbench. The smell was sharp and metallic and familiar in the way that smells from childhood are familiar even when you cannot immediately name the source. Her father had welded. She had sat in his garage on a paint bucket and watched the arc through a scrap of welding glass when she was 7 or 8. The white-hot point of light at the end of the rod, the way the puddle moved. She had not thought about that in years. She finished the last 6 inches of the seam and set the grinder down and waited for the metal to cool enough to handle. The lid lifted cleanly. Inside the box, fitted with a precision that suggested Elias had made the box specifically around its contents, were 3 things. The first was a bundle of currency, banded 50s in groups of 20. The bands, the plain white paper kind that banks use, each marked in blue ink with the amount, $1,000 per band. There were 4 bands and 1 loose 50 on top, which Ruth counted twice to be certain. $4,800 in total. The bills were not new, but they were clean and unfolded, the kind of money that has been handled carefully and stored flat in a dry place. She set them on the bench beside the box. The second item was a ledger, a standard composition book with a black marbled cover of the type sold at every drugstore in America since approximately 1940. The cover worn soft at the corners from handling. Ruth opened it. The pages were ruled and Elias had used every line, writing in the same deliberate hand as the map, though smaller here, compressed to fit more on each page. Each entry followed the same format: a name, a date, a brief description of the work performed, and in the right margin, a dollar amount. Some of the amounts had a small check mark beside them, most did not. The entries ran from 1977 through to the previous November. 46 years of work recorded in a single composition book. The pages near the front yellowed and soft. The pages near the back still white. She turned to a page near the middle and read, Garland Fetty, March of 2003. Plow point, reset and edge drawn. $18, no checkmark. Norma Kreitz, July of 2006. Tractor hitch pin fabricated, replaced, 2 sets, $22, no checkmark. Bobby Ray Alderman, September of 2009. tire irons made to spec for 30-inch rim, $11, no checkmark. The checkmarks, when they appeared, were sparse. Ruth understood after a moment what they meant. The amounts without checkmarks were amounts that had never been collected. Elias had done the work and recorded the price and either waived it at the time or simply never asked. The ledger was not a record of money owed to him. It was a record of money he had chosen not to take. The third item was a letter. It was folded in thirds in the way of a letter meant for an envelope, the paper a cream-colored bond of some weight and quality, the kind sold in stationery shops rather than office supply stores. Ruth's name was written on the outside in Elias's hand, not Ruth Calloway, but only Ruth, as though he had known her well enough to use the single name, or as though the letter was intimate enough that the last name seemed unnecessary. She unfolded it. The date at the top was March 3rd of the previous year, 9 months before Elias died. The handwriting was steady and even, no tremor in it. The letters formed with the same deliberateness as everything else he had ever written down. She read the first paragraph. She stopped. She folded the letter back along its creases and set it on top of the ledger. She was not ready to read it standing up at a workbench in a cold shop with the smell of cut metal still in the air. She understood without articulating it that the letter required a different kind of attention than she currently had to give it, that it was the kind of document that deserved stillness and time and the right quality of light, and that she was still too much in the mode of prying and grinding and lifting to receive it properly. She pressed one hand flat on top of the folded letter for a moment. Then she took her hand away. She sat down on the anvil block, which was a section of red oak log 18 inches in diameter and 24 inches tall. The top face worn smooth and dark from decades of being sat on and leaned against in the intervals between work. The block was solid under her. The shop was quiet except for the sound of the grinder ticking as it cooled and the faint movement of air through the open south windows. A barn swallow came through one of the windows, banked sharply when it registered her presence, and went back out. Ruth watched it go. She looked at the $4,800 on the bench. She looked at the ledger beside it, 46 years of names and dates and small amounts, the decades of work done for less than it was worth, and the money that had never been asked for. She looked at the folded letter with her name on it in the hand of a man who had been dead since February and who had nevertheless known, 9 months before he died, that she would be the one sitting here. She wiped the back of her wrist across her face. She sat for a long time without moving. When she finally stood, she opened the letter again, not to read it fully, but to check the last page, to see how it ended. Elias had signed it the way men of his generation signed things. His full name, Elias Monroe Calloway, and below it a single line that served as both practical instruction and farewell. It said, "Look behind the fire brick, Ruth. Use a cold chisel and be patient. The mortar is soft on the left side." She folded the letter back and held it in both hands for a moment. Then she put it in her jacket pocket, next to her chest, and began looking for a cold chisel. She drove back to Lewisburg that evening and did not read the letter until the following morning. She sat at the small table in her kitchen with the window facing east and the early light coming in, flat and clean. A cup of coffee at her right hand and the letter unfolded in front of her on the bare wood. She had ironed it the night before, carefully, with a dry iron on the lowest setting, to flatten the creases without scorching the paper. It seemed like the right thing to do. She read it slowly, the way Elias had written it, without rushing the pauses. It began without preamble, the way the man himself had spoken. March 3rd. Ruth, if you are reading this, you found the box, which means you came, which means you are the person I believed you to be when I wrote your name in that will. I want to explain some things. Not many. I was never a man for explaining. But a few. I have had this shop since 1968, which makes it 55 years by the time you read this or thereabouts. I built the forge room myself, poured the slab, set the chimney, fitted the hood. I was 32 years old, and I had $411 to my name, and I built the whole thing for 308 of it. I kept the rest for coal and flux and a used leg vise I found in a barn sale outside of Marlinton. I did not borrow money to do it because I had seen what borrowed money does to a man's choices, how it makes him say yes to things he would otherwise decline. I did not want my choices made for me that way. For 55 years I have worked iron in this room, and I have charged what I thought was fair, and in many cases I have charged less than that or nothing at all. You will have found the ledger. The names in it are real people, most of them still living, as of when I write this, as people who brought me their broken things, and sometimes could not pay, and sometimes did not offer, and sometimes I did not ask. I am not telling you this to be admired for it. I am telling you because those names belong to a community that I have been part of for 50 years, and that has been part of me. And I want you to understand what the shop is before you decide what to do with it. The $4,800 in the box is yours without condition. Use it for whatever the most pressing thing is. I imagine there is a pressing thing. There usually is. Now, behind the fire brick on the left interior wall of the forge, third course up from the fire pot, you will find the mortar is softer than the rest. I repointed that section myself in October, and I used a lime mix instead of the refractory cement so that it would cut easily with a cold chisel. There are 3 bricks that lift free once the mortar is cleared. Behind them is a cast iron pipe, 4 inches diameter. Threaded cap on each end, sealed with pipe dope. Open the near end first. The far end holds the deeds. Open that one on a flat surface because the papers inside are rolled and will want to spring open. I will not tell you what is in the pipe beyond that. Some things are better found than described. I want to say something about your husband, Daniel. I only met him twice. He had good hands, the kind that know what they are doing without making a demonstration of it. He fixed the screen door at Carol's house one Thanksgiving without being asked and without mentioning it, and I saw him do it, and that told me what I needed to know about him. I am sorry he is gone. I imagine it left a particular kind of quiet behind it that is hard to fill. I am not going to tell you the quiet gets easier because I do not know if that is true for everyone. I will say that useful work helps. It always has for me. About the property. The shop lot and the 1.2 acres it sits on were conveyed to your name by deed 6 months ago at the Pocahontas County Clerk's office. It is done and recorded and not subject to the disposition of the rest of the estate. I did this deliberately, and I did it quietly, because I did not want it discussed or argued over or complicated by the feelings of people who do not understand that a thing has value beyond what it will bring at auction. Gerald is not a bad man. He is a practical man, and practical men look at a blacksmith shop and see a liability. That is his limitation, and not his fault. You may do whatever you like with the property. Sell it if you need to. I would not blame you, but if you do not need to, I would ask you to consider what it might become in the hands of someone who knows how to look at a thing and see what it could be, rather than what it is. I have watched you do that since you were 9 years old. You walked into my shop that one summer, and you did not say it was dirty or small or that it smelled. You picked up a handled punch from the bench and asked what it was for, and when I told you, you nodded as if that were exactly the answer you had expected. I have not forgotten that. There is one more thing in the pipe that I have not mentioned. It is a smaller envelope, sealed. It contains the name and telephone number of an attorney in Elkins named Garfield Prue, who has handled my affairs for 20 years, and who is expecting to hear from you. Call him before you do anything else with the deeds. He will explain the rest more clearly than I can in a letter. I will close by saying that I have had a good life. Not an easy one and not a large one, but a good one. I worked in this room for 55 years, and I made things that were useful, and I helped people when they came to me, and I did not make more of it than it was. That is enough. I think that is enough for anyone. Take care of the anvil. It is a Fisher, 1891, and there are not many left in this condition. Oil the face when you think of it. A Fisher ring's different from other anvils, quieter, more of a thud than a ring. And people who do not know sometimes think there is something wrong with it. There is nothing wrong with it. That is just how a Fisher sounds. Yours truly, Elias Monroe Calloway. March 3rd. Ruth read it through twice, the second time more slowly than the first. When she finished, she set it flat on the table and put both hands on top of it and looked out the window at the yard behind the duplex. The patchy grass just starting to green. A plastic lawn chair overwintered in the corner of the fence. She stayed like that for a while. The coffee at her right hand went cold. She did not move to reheat it. She had called Garfield Prue the morning after reading the letter, and he had been brief and professional and unsurprised, as though he had been expecting the call for some time, which Ruth understood he had. He confirmed the deed transfer, confirmed the recording date, confirmed that the shop parcel had been legally separated from the house lot 18 months prior to Elias's death, and that the separation had been executed cleanly and was not subject to challenge under West Virginia interstate law or any other provision she needed to concern herself with. He said she should come to his office in Elkins at her convenience, and they would go through the full picture. He said there was a full picture to go through. He did not elaborate, and she did not push him, because she had learned from Elias's letter that some things were better found than described, and she was beginning to understand that Garfield Prue operated according to similar principles. She made the appointment for the following Thursday and spent the days before it going back to the shop each morning, working through the inventory she had started on her first visit, opening drawers and cataloging contents and making a handwritten list in a spiral notebook she had bought at the drugstore in Lewisburg for $1.49. The drawers of the workbench held a lifetime of small hardware, sorted with a precision that was nearly obsessive. Lag screws by length in labeled glass jars, washers by diameter, cotter pins in a segmented wooden box that Elias had made himself from scrap walnut, each compartment sized exactly to its contents. The sorting was not the habit of a man with nothing to do. It was the habit of a man who did not want to waste time looking for things when the work was in front of him. On Wednesday afternoon, 2 days before her appointment with Prue, Ruth was in the shop with the south windows open and the spring air moving through, working at the workbench with a wire brush and a can of evaporust, cleaning the surface rust from a set of handled punches she had found wrapped in oilcloth in the bottom drawer when she heard a vehicle on the 2-track. She set the punch down and waited. The vehicle was a late-model pickup, dark green, clean, the kind of truck that is used occasionally rather than daily. It pulled up beside her own car, and a man got out. Gerald Mott was 53 years old and carried himself with the particular ease of a man who has never had to think very hard about money. Not from wealth exactly, but from a consistent sufficiency that has never been seriously threatened. He was not large, but he took up his full space. He wore a canvas barn jacket over a flannel shirt, and his boots were clean. He looked at her car, and then at the open shop door, and then walked to the door and knocked on the frame, which was a courtesy Ruth had not expected, since the door was open and she was visible from where he stood. She said to come in. He did, stopping just inside the threshold and looking around the shop with the expression of a man conducting an appraisal he has been asked not to conduct. His eyes went to the anvil, then the forge, then the tools on the wall, then the workbench where Ruth stood with the wire brush still in her hand. He nodded once, slowly, as though confirming a number he had already calculated in his head. He said it was cleaner than he expected. Ruth said Elias had kept it up. Gerald said he supposed he had. He did not come further into the shop. He stood with his thumbs in the front pockets of his jacket and said he wanted to be straightforward with her because they were family, and because he thought she deserved straightforwardness. He said he knew the parcel was hers and that was fine, that he was not contesting anything. He said he had spoken with a man named Burkett, who was a developer out of Elkins, who had approached Gerald twice about the full property over the last few years, and who had expressed continued interest in the shop lot, specifically because of its road frontage on County Road 7. He said Burkett had authorized Gerald to convey a number. The number was $42,000 for the lot and structure as is. No inspection contingency. Cash close in 30 days. Ruth set the wire brush down on the bench. She looked at Gerald and waited to see if there was more. There was. He said he wanted her to understand that the property tax on the parcel was running $640 a year, and that the structure, while solid in some respects, had a compromised rafter on the north slope and a gutter situation, and likely needed its electrical brought up to current code throughout. Not just the one GFCI outlet someone had put in. He said he was not trying to pressure her, but that a cash offer at that number for a non-operational outbuilding on a dirt 2-track in Pocahontas County was not something that came along regularly, and that she might want to think about it before Thursday. He said Thursday in a way that suggested he knew about the appointment with Prue, though Ruth could not determine how. She did not say yes. She did not say no. She said she appreciated him coming out and that she would think about the offer and be in touch. Gerald nodded and looked once more around the shop, his gaze settling briefly on the forge, then on the floor where the oak planks lay fitted back into their rebate, nothing to indicate that anything had been beneath them. He said she could reach him on his cell. He pulled a card from his jacket pocket and set it on the corner of the workbench nearest the door. He said to take care of herself and walked back to his truck. Ruth stood at the workbench and listened to the truck back down the 2-track and turn onto the gravel and fade. She picked up the card. It was a plain white card, Gerald Mott, his phone number, nothing else. She carried it to the anvil and set it on the face of the fissure, on the dark oiled steel between the Pritchell hole and the Hardy hole, and left it there. She picked up the wire brush and went back to the handled punch she had been cleaning. The rust came off in long brown streaks against the steel beneath, which was clean and gray and entirely uncompromised. She worked through the set, one punch at a time, and when she was done, she wrapped them back in fresh oilcloth and returned them to the drawer and closed it. That evening, she drove past Vess Feed and Supply on her way out and saw the lights still on inside. She slowed but did not stop. She thought about the number Gerald had said, $42,000, and she thought about what Garfield Prue had implied when he said there was a full picture to go through. She thought about Elias at 74 moving his careful hands around Carol's good china, and about the screen door Daniel had fixed without being asked, and about the fact that Elias had known both of those things and had written them down in a letter he sealed inside a welded box inside a clay-lined pit beneath the floor of a building he had left to her specifically and not to anyone else. She drove back to Lewisburg in the early dark and did not think about the $42,000 again that night. She was at the shop by 7:30 Thursday morning, 2 hours before her appointment with Garfield Prue in Elkins. She had brought a cold chisel and a 2-pound drilling hammer from the hardware store in Lewisburg. A new cold chisel still in its plastic sleeve, the kind with the octagonal shank and the machined tip, 7/16 across the cutting edge. She had also brought a headlamp because the interior of the forge hood was dark even with the south windows open, and she needed to see the mortar clearly. She put on her work gloves and the headlamp, and climbed onto the anvil block and leaned into the forge over the fire pot and found the third course of fire brick from the bottom on the left interior wall. The mortar was softer there. She could see it without touching it, the color slightly different from the surrounding refractory mortar, more gray than tan, the texture of it less crystalline. She set the chisel at the first vertical joint and tapped it twice with the hammer, and the mortar crumbled cleanly. 3 or 4 taps per joint, and it came free in short sections, the lime mix releasing without resistance the way Elias had said it would. She worked the horizontal joints next, the chisel skating along the soft material, the debris falling into the fire pot below in small pale clumps. It took her 9 minutes to clear all 4 joints around the first brick. She set the chisel aside and worked the brick free with her fingers, rocking it gently side to side until it came out in her hand, heavier than it looked, the mass of old fired clay, solid and dense. The second brick and the third followed more easily, the middle one lifting almost without resistance once the surrounding joints were cut. Behind them was a void in the brick wall roughly 12 inches wide and 8 inches tall, the interior dark and smelling of old mortar and something faintly mineral that she could not name. She reached in and her gloved fingers found the pipe immediately, cold and smooth. 4 inches of cast iron sitting horizontal in the void on 2 small steel brackets that had been welded to the back wall of the cavity. The pipe was perhaps 14 inches long with threaded caps on both ends, the caps seated tight but not fused, the threads sealed with pipe dope that had dried to a dark brown crust at the joint. She gripped the near cap with both hands and turned. It broke free on the third attempt, the pipe dope crackling as the threads separated, and she caught the smell of the interior before she looked into it, dry and faintly sweet. The smell of paper that has been sealed in a dry, dark place for a long time. She tilted the pipe and the contents slid toward the open end. A bundle of currency, banded, came out first, and she caught it and set it on the anvil block below her without counting it. Then a smaller roll of paper slid out, 2 documents rolled together and secured with a rubber band that had lost most of its elasticity and fell apart when she removed it. She set those aside. Then nothing, which told her the near end was empty. She replaced the cap and worked the far cap. The far cap was stiffer, the threads tighter, the pipe dope thicker at this joint. She used the flat of the chisel against the cap lug for leverage, and it broke with a sound like a knuckle cracking and turned freely after that. Inside the far end was a single envelope, letter-sized, sealed, with Garfield Prue's name and address printed on the back flap in the same careful hand as everything else Elias had ever written down. She set it with the other items and replaced the loose bricks in the wall, fitting them back into the void without mortar for now, the weight of them sufficient to hold them in place until she could decide what to do with the opening permanently. She climbed down from the anvil block and carried everything to the workbench and counted. The currency was banded in the same plain white bank bands as the money in the floor box, but the denominations were mixed, 50s and hundreds, the hundreds on the outside of each band. She counted the bands first, then opened each one, and counted the bills inside and wrote the total in her spiral notebook in the column she had started for this purpose. 11 bands. The totals varied, some bands holding $1,000, some $1,500, one holding $2,000 flat. When she added the column, the sum was $61,400. She wrote it down and looked at it and wrote it again on the line below to be certain she had not misread her own handwriting. $61,400. She set the notebook on the bench and stood very still for a moment. She unrolled the 2 documents. They were deeds, both of them, both recorded at the Pocahontas County Courthouse, both bearing the official stamp and the signature of the county clerk. The first was the deed conveying the shop parcel to Ruth Ann Calloway, the same deed Garfield Prue had referenced on the telephone, recorded 8 months prior. The second was a deed she had not been told about, conveying an additional parcel. 6.4 acres of bottomland on the east side of County Road 7, running from the shop lot boundary south to the creek, recorded 4 months prior, 3 months before Elias died. She read the legal description twice and looked at her hand-drawn map and confirmed what she was reading. The field she had driven past on her way in, the one running flat and green between the road and the tree line, was on the deed. It was hers. She drove to Elkins with the envelope for Prue on the passenger seat and the notebook open to the column of figures. Prue's office was on the 3rd floor of a building on Davis Avenue, a quiet space with 2 windows overlooking the street and a desk that held nothing except a legal pad and a pen and a thin manila folder. Prue was 67, spare, with the unhurried manner of a man who has delivered complicated news many times and has learned that the delivery is easier when the pace is slow. He opened the envelope she handed him, read the single page inside, and set it on the folder. He said it was a letter of instruction he had been holding in his own files as a duplicate. He said Elias had written it in October, before he died, as a confirmation of everything Ruth had just found. Prue explained the situation in the same plain sequence that Elias had used in his letter, without decoration. The shop parcel was recorded and uncontestable. The bottomland parcel was the same. The combined assessed value of both parcels under current county records was $43,800, which was a county figure and bore no relationship to market value, which Prue estimated at roughly double that for the bottomland alone, given its road frontage and water access. He said Gerald Mott's developer friend Burkett had in fact approached him directly 6 months prior, before Elias died, and had been informed that the parcels were not available. He said Burkett's $42,000 offer, which covered only the shop lot, represented a significant undervaluation of what Ruth actually held. He said Gerald may or may not have been aware of this when he conveyed the offer. He said it in a tone that suggested he had an opinion about which was more likely, but that the opinion was not his to share. The matter resolved itself in 11 days. Prue filed the necessary confirmations with the county clerk's office and sent Gerald a brief letter by certified mail outlining the recorded status of both parcels and noting that no further communication regarding purchase offers should be directed to his client. Gerald did not respond. He did not come back to the shop. Ruth drove past his house on Route 219 once, not deliberately, on her way to the feed store, and his truck was in the driveway and the lights were on inside, and that was all. He was not a bad man. He had looked at a blacksmith shop and seen a liability, and he had been wrong about what it contained, and he had retreated from that error without making a further occasion of it. Ruth thought that was probably the best that could be asked of anyone. The rafter on the north slope was a doubled 2x10 that had split along the grain where a nail had been driven too close to the edge 40 years prior, the split opening slowly over decades until the roof deck above it had begun to sag. Ruth found a carpenter in Hillsborough named Walt Osgood, who came out on a Saturday in late April, walked the roof in his work boots, came back down the ladder and told her what it would take. He said $260 for materials and 4 hours of his time at $40 an hour. He said she could watch if she wanted to know how it was done. She said she did want to know. She handed him the materials money in cash that morning, and he came back the following Saturday with his son, who was 17, and moved on roofs like he had been born to it, and by noon the rafter was sistered, and the deck was re-nailed, and the tin was reset, and the shop had a sound roof for the first time in several years. The gutter came next. She did this herself. A Tuesday afternoon in early May with a new section of 5-inch K-style aluminum gutter from the hardware store in Dunmore, a box of gutter screws, a tube of sealant, and a borrowed ladder from Harlan Vess, who had offered it without being asked when she stopped for coffee and mentioned the project. The work took her 3 hours and one trip back to the store for a replacement end cap she had measured wrong the first time. When she was done, she ran the hose along the roof edge and watched the water move cleanly through the gutter and down the downspout into the gravel below without spilling. Small satisfactions. She had learned from somewhere that they added up. The electrical was the one thing she did not attempt herself. She found an electrician in Marlinton named Cecilia Dunbar, who held her license and had been working in Pocahontas County for 16 years. Cecilia spent a full day in the shop, running new Romex from a 60-amp sub-panel Ruth had installed at the road, replacing 2 ancient cloth-wrapped circuits that ran along the ceiling joists and posed risks Cecilia described in plain terms without drama. She installed 4 new duplex outlets on the workbench wall, 2 on the forge wall, a pair of overhead shop lights on a switched circuit, and a dedicated 20-amp line for the angle grinder and similar tools. The bill was $940. Ruth paid it from the money in the floor box and did not feel the loss of it. She found Denny Ware through Harlan Vess, which was how she was beginning to understand most useful things in that county were found, through Harlan Vess, or through someone Harlan Vess mentioned in passing. Denny was 26, from a hollow outside of Hillsborough, and had learned smithing from his grandfather, and then from 2 years at a technical program in Roanoke that had since closed. He had been looking for shop work for 8 months and had been doing fence repair and general farm labor in the meantime, competent work that was not the work he wanted. Harlan mentioned him on a Wednesday. Ruth drove to the Hollow on Friday. Denny came to the door in his work clothes, which told her he had not assumed the visit was social. She asked him 3 questions about forge welding and listened to the answers. She offered him the shop at a flat monthly rent of $200 against a percentage of billings, above a threshold they negotiated at the kitchen table over 40 minutes, both of them with paper and pencil, neither of them in a hurry. Denny moved his tools in on a Monday in early June. He was not a large person, but he moved iron with an economy that came from genuine understanding, the hammer falling where he intended it to fall, the work turning in the tongs at the right moment, no wasted motion. Ruth came by on his 3rd day and watched him draw out a tendon on a gate hinge from 5/8 round stock, the steel orange at the working end, the hammer rhythm steady and unhurried. She stood in the doorway and did not interrupt. When he set the work in the slack tub and the steam went up, she asked him how it was going. He said the fisher rang different than he expected. She said that was just how a fisher sounded. He nodded and picked up his hammer. Harlan Vess came by the following week, ostensibly to return a set of post-hole diggers he had borrowed from Elias 3 years prior and had been meaning to bring back. He stood in the shop doorway and looked at Denny at the forge and at the shop lights burning overhead and at the tools on the wall in their order on their nails. He did not say much. He set the post-hole diggers against the wall inside the door and looked at the anvil and the fisher eagle cast into the waist of it and put his hand on the face of it for a moment, not pressing, just resting. He said Elias would have thought the arrangement was sensible. Ruth said she hoped so. Harlan said he was going to get back and that she should stop in for coffee anytime. He drove out the 2-track and turned onto the gravel and was gone. People came. Not many at first, and then more steadily as word moved through the county the way word moves in small places, without announcement, one conversation at a time. A man from Arbovale brought a cultivator tooth that needed rebuilding. A woman from the valley brought 3 fireplace tools with cracked handles and asked if the handles could be replaced with something heavier. A farrier from Marlinton, getting older and looking to pass some of the shoeing work, sent 2 of his clients to Denny directly. Norma Kreitz, whose name Ruth had read in the ledger in the entry from 2006, came in on a Thursday afternoon in July with a chain for a barn door that had a twisted link she wanted rewelded. She looked around the shop and said it smelled the same as it always had. Ruth said she was glad to hear it. Norma paid $9 for the chain work and left. On a Tuesday afternoon in late July, Ruth was at the workbench going through the ledger again, not for any practical purpose, but because she found herself returning to it, the way you return to a document that contains something you are still in the process of understanding, when a woman knocked at the open door. She was perhaps 30, in work clothes, driving a truck with a stock trailer attached that was carrying 2 quarter horses. She said she had heard there was a farrier working here now. Ruth said there was, but he was out until Thursday. The woman said she could come back Thursday. She asked what the rate was for a trim and reset on 2 horses. Ruth opened the ledger to the back page where Elias had recorded his last farrier rate, which was $34 per horse for a trim, $49 for shoes. She quoted it without adjusting for inflation, the same way Elias had quoted it for 40 years, because it seemed like the right number to start from. The woman said that was fair and that she would come back Thursday, and she drove out. Ruth watched the stock trailer go down the 2-track and turn onto County Road 7 and disappear behind the cedars. She took the $34 the woman had left as a deposit and put it in a mason jar she had set on the shelf below the workbench, which was where she was keeping the shop's operating cash until she figured out a better system. The jar already held some money, not much, a week's worth of small transactions, the $9 for Norma's chain and a few others. She screwed the lid back on the jar and set it on the shelf, and stood there for a moment in the shop with the late afternoon light coming level through the south windows and the overhead lights making the space warm, and the smell of coal and iron and linseed oil the same as it had always been. She sat on the step outside, and the evening came in from the east, the cedar trees going dark at their centers first while the tips held the last of the light. The shop light burned behind her through the open door, falling out across the gravel apron in a long, warm rectangle. A nighthawk cut across the sky above the tree line once and was gone. She thought about Elias driving in and out of this two-track for 50 years, in all weather, in the 1991 Ford with 212,000 miles on it, coming to do the work and then going home and coming back. She thought about the Fisher anvil inside, oiled and steady, and the tools in their order on the wall, and the ledger full of names of people who had needed something and found it here. Honest work done quietly. It was enough. It had always been enough.